So it's first of all, I want to say it's frickin' delightful to be here at ChefConf and to talk about the partnership that Microsoft's got with Chef going on, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. Now, the reason I said frickin' and delightful was I got this email from the speaker coordinator saying, we've got this awesome event, and it's going to be delightful. And I was like, I don't know, it looks like you got to swear to be hip around here at this kind of conference. So I forwarded the email to our PR people, and I said, is it okay if I swear at this conference? Because Microsoft's got a policy against this. And so they said, absolutely not. So I'm not going to be swearing today. So first, just to get a feel for how familiar you are with Microsoft and Azure, how many people have heard of Microsoft? So that's a good sign. How about Azure? How many people have heard of Azure? Still quite a few. How many people have used Azure? So a lot less than I'd like. So what I'm going to do is tell you just a little bit about Azure so that those of you that aren't familiar with it get an idea for that we've been busy for a number of years building out our public cloud infrastructure. And I'm going to throw a bunch of statistics here at you to give you an idea of the scale that we've gotten to in this few short years that we've been operational. This map right here shows you the number of regional deployments we've got. We've got at least one data center, in many cases more than one, 3 or 4. In each of these regions, you can see there's 16 around the world. It's the most of any public cloud provider that's operating today in terms of public footprint, regional footprint. And then here's a bunch of stats that show you the scale of different services. For example, over on the far right, you see that we've got 1 million SQL databases currently active right now in Azure. So databases that people have deployed. You can see that in terms of adoption, greater than 57% of the Fortune 500 are using Azure. We've got over 300 million users provisioned in what we call Windows or Microsoft Azure Active Directory, our identity service, and that's served over 13 billion authentication requests to date. The truly staggering number, though, is the 20 trillion storage objects we've got in our Microsoft Azure storage service, and that service is delivering over 2 million requests per second right now. So you can see some pretty big numbers that we've got going on in our public cloud. And we've got some companies that have taken massive mission-critical bet the business bets on us. One of them is NBC. So how many of you watched the Olympics? That's the idea. How many watched from a mobile device or streaming on the web? Because those of you that did, you were watching streaming from Azure. NBC Sports, with the partnership with Microsoft, delivered the entire Olympics on top of Azure. So you can see that there was 100 million viewers throughout the course of the Olympics watching streamed video that was delivered off of Azure. And a record-setting live streaming event, so live encoding and streaming to the web, was the USA-Canada hockey game. And you can see that there was 2.1 million concurrent viewers for that. Now, how many people are into gaming and Titanfall? Anybody play Titanfall in here? So that's a pretty awesome release for this year. You can see Titanfall video here. That launched on Xbox Live as the back-end platform for that, which is running on Azure. This is all the game servers are running on Azure. And at the peak, over 100,000 concurrent virtual machines actively running Titanfall. And that really demonstrates the use of the cloud and the elasticity that we've got in Azure, because a game like Titanfall has big swings in terms of number of players that are actively on it. Right after launch, of course, big jumps, and whenever they have downloadable content, big jumps. When they introduced a platform like Xbox 360 last week, we had a massive spike, and that's when we hit our peak as a whole bunch of new players came on board. And I've got a short, 1-minute video to show you about Titanfall and its use on Windows Azure. So why don't we roll that clip?
Traditionally, building any sort of server technology has been pretty difficult for any developer. We saw cloud computing as an opportunity to introduce hands-off, scalable, on-demand resources so game developers could focus more on the game.
What that means is there's data centers all over the globe, and when you start up the game, it figures out where you are and what the best connection to which data center you have is. And it'll spin up a server, a dedicated server in a server farm for you, fast connection with fast CPUs.
We can maximize what we're doing, knowing full well that on the back end, we have the power there to take advantage of the game.
It makes matchmaking really quick, and then once you're in the game, it's a really consistent experience.
It's a more even experience. There's no host advantage. There's no worry about who's hosting what, and do we have to now reserve performance on everybody's machine.
So you don't have people doing lag switch killing, you don't have host migration, you have just solid gameplay that's fair for everybody. If anyone asks for a server, just throw them a server, throw them a server, throw them a server. And then we replenish that pool from the cloud. And so when we need another one, we just grab it down, put it in our pool, and then hand it out to somebody. So it's this constantly available set of servers all over the globe for anyone.
But one of the things we're seeing that's really amazing about Titanfall is the idea that a lot of the AI and the non-player characters are actually powered by the server.
That would not be feasible to do on a game that's client hosted.
For the first time, I think users are seeing why server technology is really going to make next generation gaming that much better.
So that's pretty cool. Let me talk a little bit more about our stack, just to give you a flavor for the kinds of services that we've got on Azure. Starting at the bottom, of course, the cloud infrastructure, which I've been talking about. Moving up into two branches, really. The infrastructure as a service branch, where we've got the basic virtual machine capabilities, of course. We've got Windows virtual machines, and this kind of surprised the world when we launched Windows Azure Preview. We launched with not just Windows, but also Linux virtual machines, and people thought cows were flying or something at that point. We've got storage and networking for infrastructure as a service, of course. And then over on the platform as a service side, we've got websites, we've got mobile back-end services, we've got data service, data analytics services, the streaming media, which is what you saw the Sochi Olympics take advantage of. We've got PaaS cloud services, which are a virtual machine-based platform as a service. And then, of course, we've got identity, as I mentioned. And above that, we've got a bunch of programming languages and tools, which I'll talk a little bit more about here on this slide, starting with our development environments. Of course, Microsoft, we've got our own development environment in-house called Visual Studio that we spend a lot of energy on and making sure that that integrates really well with Microsoft Azure. We've got Visual Studio Online, which back on the earlier stats, I think mentioned that we've got, or on the slide it mentioned that we've got over 1 million users on Visual Studio Online. We've got support for Eclipse as well, for people doing Java development. We've got, on Azure, we've got integration with Eclipse and Java for Azure. As far as operating systems, I already mentioned, we've got Windows and Linux and different flavors of Linux. We also have VM images that have databases already set up inside of them. So we've got SQL Server images. We've also done a partnership with Oracle, which is another pigs fly or cows fly moment for Microsoft, is a partnership with Oracle, so you can get Oracle databases spun up in Azure. And then when it comes to PaaS integration from the server side, we've got support for a whole bunch of languages. I mentioned Java, but we've also got support for Node.js as a first-class environment, PHP, Python, and more are coming on board. And then for websites, we've embraced a whole bunch of CMS, third-party CMS platforms that you can spin up very easily just with one click on Azure. And then finally, for the mobile side of the cloud, we've also got support for other platforms like the one with the robot and the other one. And then database as a service as well. So a whole bunch of, I think one of the themes that you're seeing here as I go through this is it's not just about Microsoft technology. It's about the technologies that you use, that the world uses, and enabling those technologies, whether it's on the client side or the server side, to come onto Azure. And then also on the operational side, this is a place where we started to focus as well now. Starting with an announcement we made at the Build conference here in San Francisco about a little less than 2 weeks ago, where we announced integration with Puppet and Chef as first-class partners on our Windows Azure VMs. So you can spin up a VM, injecting the Puppet agent or the Chef client inside of those VMs. Of course, we've also got our own first-party PowerShell DSC, desired state configuration support, built into the platform as well. But again, open, so we know lots of people, obviously all of you, are using platform, a configuration deployment system that's not Microsoft-based, and we want to make sure that you can leverage that as you come onto Azure. Azure Active Directory, we've got monitoring services built in, and we also have auto-scaling, which is a key capability of course, of any operational DevOps kind of world, is you want the thing to take care of itself, monitor itself, and take cues off the metrics to automatically scale up and down when necessary. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Chef integration that we've got with Azure. So we've started this partnership with Chef a good while ago, I think over a year ago, where we started integrating support for Knife into Azure, as well as adding Azure recipes and resource providers so that people could spin up Azure resources as part of their recipes. So why don't we switch to the demo machine, and I'll show you a quick look at the Knife support. So we've got Knife Azure here. The list of commands that we support. These are all virtual machine-based or oriented commands like virtual machine availability groups. You can list the OS images. You can create servers. You can delete servers, list the servers. So for example, if I do Knife Azure list, server list, we'll see the list of servers that I've already spun up using Knife. Let's just take a few seconds. And there we go. So I've already been in the process of setting up for this, done a lot of playing around with Knife. And then finally, this is what I'm getting lag on this for some reason. I guess it's, please shut off your wireless devices. Here's the Knife Azure Server Create command, because I'm SSH'd, of course, into an Azure virtual machine, showing you this. So this is going to create a virtual machine with the Chef client installed in it and automatically bootstrapped to show up as a node in the Chef management console. Why don't we switch back to the slides, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing to further integrate operations into Azure virtual machines and infrastructure as a service. And really, if you start to look at the integration of configuration, management, and deployment into virtual machines, it's what we see this as is a blending of IaaS and PaaS. And at that announcement we made at the Build conference a couple weeks ago, this support for extensions that enable bringing Chef and Puppet into Azure virtual machines was enabled by us taking the actual agent, our runtime agent that we've got in our platform as a service VMs, and porting that over to the infrastructure as a service VMs. And using that agent and pointing at a gallery of extensions, that agent is able to pull extensions down dynamically, ask for configuration, and configure those agents right inside of the virtual machine. And really, the possibilities are kind of limitless here. Puppet and Chef are two examples. BG Info, one of my tools from sysinternals, is one that you can automatically provision when you go through the VM setup wizard in Azure and get a desktop background with information about the server right there when you remote into your Windows machine. But monitoring agents, antivirus agents, encryption agents, key management agents, all sorts of things that you can enable with this kind of extensibility. And we've taken this extensibility a step further, and this is an announcement, another pig's fly moment right here. At this conference, we're announcing integration with Chef for the first ever Linux agent support, Linux extension support on Azure. So this is taking that same agent that we have running on Windows, porting it to Linux, and then making sure that the Chef extension works on it, working with Chef. Great partnership there. It's and providing a consistent experience between Chef on Windows VMs and Chef on Linux VMs. So now whether you use Linux or Windows, and I'm not going to bother asking how many of you use Linux, because I'm afraid I'll know the answer, you can take advantage of Chef now on Azure. And so why don't I switch now and and show you a demo of that in action and that integration in action. First thing I'm going to do is I've got a setup here, which is a Twitter client. This is running in the Windows Azure website, and it's going to pull from the handle that we see, whatever we type in there. So I've typed in chefconf already, and when we press next, what this is going to do is go pull, use the Twitter API to go pull the tweets on that handle and display them in this interface. And I just press the next button. You can see this is going to take a while. And in fact, I zoom in here, you can see that it took almost 10 seconds to go pull that feed. Of course, if your website responds like this in 10 seconds, people think you've worked on healthcare.gov or something, and that's really not a great experience. So, of course, the way that you get improvements when it's a list of content right here that you can pull once and then show ongoing in an ongoing manner is to use some kind of cache in between you and the data source. So in Windows Azure, there's a bunch of different options for configuring a cache for a website. We've got our own built-in caching service, of course. But let's just pretend that I'm a Redis fan, and I love using Redis as my cache. And so how do we stand up a Redis server in Azure? And I want to do it using Chef. So it's a Redis VM. I want to configure it using Chef. Let's go through that process and what it would look like using this new support. And it's, of course, going to be on Linux. So our first step is to go to the Azure Management Portal, which this is the current portal, the current production portal. The user experience here is that you see a list of resource types over on the left side. I've got selected the virtual machine resource type. You can see here a bunch of those virtual machines that we saw earlier when I did the knife server list command. And I'm going to use this new button down here to create a new virtual machine from our virtual machine gallery. And when I come to the gallery, I can pick from a bunch of different Windows images. I can pick from a number of different Linux images. I'm going to pick Ubuntu here, and I like Ubuntu 13.1. I press Next. And I pick a virtual machine name here. I'm going to pick Mark Redis. And I get to pick the virtual machine size. And down here, how I authenticate to that virtual machine. So this is asking me about an SSL cert. I don't trust SSL anymore, so I'm going to just say I'm going to provide a password. And then I get to paste in my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 password. Oh, 8 characters. That one's not going to work. So why don't we? Yeah, 7, 8. There we go. It's much more secure too. So. And then finally, in this page, we get to deploy a cloud, pick which region we want to deploy that virtual machine to. We also get to open up network ports. I'm going to open up the Redis network port so that Redis, our application, can talk to Redis, and it's 6379. I know all port numbers, by the way. So, and then finally, this is the page where the magic happens. This is where we get to specify that we want the agent installed in this virtual machine. Of course, we can go bare bones and not have an agent in there, and it's just a raw VM. But once we install the agent, then we have the ability to inject these extensions. And the first, like I mentioned and announced, the first extension that we're supporting on Linux is Chef. And at this point, you can configure that Chef extension. So first, the client RB file, which I've got right here. And if we open it up, you can see this is going to point that virtual machine at our hosted Chef server here. And we can see the node name, which matches what the virtual machine name that I created earlier. So I'm going to select that, get my key in here. And then the run list, this is a Redis server that we want to create. So, of course, I'm going to specify the Redis recipe. And I'm ready to go. And at this point, in a few minutes, we're going to have a virtual machine with Redis installed in it because Chef has pulled it down and done the magic to get Redis installed. Now, I've already, we're not going to wait for that virtual machine to get created. I've already got one, another Redis server that I provisioned a little bit earlier. And I'm going to show you, whoop, wrong VM, wrong, here we go. I'm going to show you that this VM was configured using Chef. And it does have the Redis recipe already applied to it. So you can see that no updates required, and we already have Redis here as the recipe that's been launched in this. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you is that the Redis server has actually not had any action yet. So it's cached nothing at this point. This is to prove to you that this is a live demo of getting the cache warmed up on this client application. Now, one of the things that we support in Windows Azure is staging and production websites, where you can swap a staging production sites among each other. And this is a great way to do updates, where you do side-by-side deployments, do your testing on staging, and then flip over to production. And so I'm going to open a staged version of that website here, which is pointing at that Redis server that I just showed you the internals of. When I press refresh here, this is going to take a while because this is the first time that that Redis server was hit and the cache is being populated. So we get about the same latency that we saw earlier. But now when I go back to that virtual machine and run the Redis keys command again, you can see now that I've got a key set that is from that chef conf Twitter handle in there. And now if I go back and press F5, now we're seeing response times, which I'd expect because we're pulling that content now off that Redis server that we configured with Chef. So that is an example of using that Chef integration and the power of Chef on Linux with Azure. I wanted to show you one last thing, though, which isn't really directly related to Chef, but has to do with kind of our view of DevOps and where we're taking our portal experience. Because as much as we're all using command line interfaces and fully automated, we still use portals to go and look at monitoring information and to go make manual changes when automation fails us or we've got gaps. And so I want to show you the portal that we've got in preview mode that we also announced at Build a few weeks ago. And that portal, let me see if I've got it loaded up here, is right here. This is the new preview portal. You can see it's a lot different look. This is kind of a sliced look. Instead of looking at things resource-oriented view, what you're seeing is an app-oriented view, where you define what an app is. And we help you define what an app is through a concept we call resource groups, which are collections of resources, and resources can be just anything, really. It's a fully extensible model. So resources include things like virtual machines, storage accounts, websites. They can include things like email server or whatever. If you've got a REST endpoint, that can become a resource that you plug into resource groups. I've pinned that website that we've been looking at here into this portal here. It's the Mark Twitter Reader website. And when I click on that, we're going to slide over and get a view of that website's activity. So you can see here analytics on the website, activity on the website, scale on the website. But what I'm going to do is I've got that staged website that has the Redis server, so it's performing a lot better. And I got my production server, which we first looked at, which had that slow performance. And I want to swap those two. So I'm going to use the swap button here to swap them. And that's going to let me pick which stage slot I want to swap with. There's only one. And I select it. And now the swap operation is going to start. And over here, it's going to turn flash green and tell me when that's completed. While that's going on, let me show you the scale button here. When you slide that open, you can see that I've been operating with one website. And I can manually scale up and down. Or I can go to a performance scale up and scale down. And I can pick a metric that's coming out of the web server. By default, it'll go off CPU usage. And you can see if it drops below 30% for a certain number of minutes, it's going to scale down. And if it goes above 80%, it's going to scale up. This is our auto-scaling service, which we also released to general availability at the Build conference a couple weeks ago. And that's an example of how we enable the DevOps model using our auto-scale service, as well as giving you a look at what's going on in this new portal interface, which makes everything basically one fingertip away and gives you the ability to drill down deeply into any aspect of your application. So I think this thing is done. So if I go back to that first web page that I had open, this is the production slot. So this is that Mark Twitter Reader, AzureWebsites.net. And if I press F5 now, we get that fast experience because that is now that Redis server that's been swapped out. So that is a quick look at the integration between Chef and Azure, as well as our new portal experience that's going to give people a much easier way to manage their applications, whether they're virtual machine applications or combination of PaaS and IaaS. Now, why don't we switch back to the presentation, and I'll wrap it up. So if you want to get started in Azure, there's a bunch of different ways you can get started. Free trials. You get up to $200 of usage across any Azure service with the free trial. If you're an MSDN subscriber, how many people work at a company that has MSDN benefits? So all of you have this access to a varying amount of money per month to use on Azure, just as part of that membership between $50 and $200 a month. And you can see that buys you a whole bunch of VM time if you want it. And then finally, on an ongoing basis, if you use MSDN, you get a very flat rate, a very low rate for your websites and VMs and other resources in Azure, much lower than the retail prices for those things. So I recommend you take advantage of that to get started in Azure if you've got it. Lastly, call to action. Try Chef on Azure. There's a session this afternoon, Cooking in the Cloud, Chef in Azure at 125. We've got a booth here, Microsoft booth's right outside the door. And if you tweet a photo so here with hashtag ChefConf and hashtag Azure together, then you're entered automatically to win a prize. We're giving away 1 prize an hour. It's a pretty cool little gyroscope thing you can go check out at the Microsoft booth. And finally, send us feedback. We're responsive. We want to make it possible for you to get the most out of Chef on Azure. So send us requests. Tell us what you want. Visit us at the booth. Send email. And lastly, oh, what the hell? It's Chef and Azure delightful. So thanks very much.